The giant sloth was a landscape architect, a 4-ton herbivore whose movement and appetite maintained the structural health of American ecosystems for millions of years. When it vanished, the continent lost more than just a species. It lost a primary engine of biological stability. Across the Americas, 32 genera of large mammals disappeared within a 2,000-year window, centered on 11,000 years ago. This was not a slow drift into extinction. It was a sharp clinical excision from the fossil record. While smaller animals survived, the megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, and sloths weighing 8,000 pounds suffered a collapse of up to 83%. The timing defies traditional environmental cycles. Previous glacial transitions occurred, yet these giants adapted and thrived until they suddenly buckled under a pressure that targeted size itself. The specific mechanism that transformed the Americas into a tomb for the giants and why it struck with such lethal precision remains an open question. We are treating this as an active investigation, sifting through bone, climate data, and impact proxies to determine if this extinction was a catastrophe, a result of human pressure, or a collision with an unknown force. We now move to the environmental evidence to see if the biological record holds the answer to this rapid continental-scale collapse. The biological record serves as an archive of physiological stress. Investigators track isotope signatures preserved in teeth and fossil collagen, which function as high-resolution clocks. These data points provide a precise window into the diet, hydration, and movement patterns of these animals during their final millennia. When geochemical signals deviate from the baseline of the preceding 100,000 years, the data indicates a staggered, localized decline rather than a uniform continent-wide event. This geographic variation moves the evidence beyond simple, one-size-fits-all narratives. If the extinction was a cascading failure triggered by environmental shifts, the first signs of stress should appear in species with the most specialized diets or the lowest tolerance for temperature fluctuations. The forensic trail suggests a sequence where different genera succumb to distinct pressures in specific ecological niches. The remains show a clear disconnect between their energy requirements and the fracturing of their food webs. As we shift from isotope data to the skeletal morphology of the giants, the physical architecture of these animals reveals a specific vulnerability bound to their scale. Their proportions were constraints that limited their reaction to the changing landscape, directly linking their physical mass to their collapse. Yet, this anatomy only hints at the massive dimensions of the beasts themselves. Their skeletal structure confirms a design that defies modern biology. These animals relied on a tripod stance, shifting 8,000 pounds of mass onto a thick, muscular tail and 2 hind legs to reach 7 meters into the canopy. When Thomas Jefferson documented the first North American ground sloth, Megalonyx jeffersoni, he famously misidentified those curved blade-like claws as belonging to a giant cat. He could not conceive of a mammal that walked on the sides of its feet, knuckle-walking like a living high-torque forklift. This was an anatomy built for intense leverage, calibrated to pull down tree limbs untouchable to any other creature. Their bone density served as the primary anchor for a massive landscape-altering process. By processing vast volumes of vegetation daily, they maintained clearing densities and seed dispersal patterns that effectively kept the forests open. Their presence was a literal environmental pressure. For generations, the ground sloth was depicted solely as a massive obligate herbivore, its identity tethered to a diet of bark and leaves. But a 2021 study utilizing nitrogen isotope analysis in tooth enamel dismantled that static portrait. The chemical signatures embedded in their remains tell a different story. These creatures were omnivorous. By opportunistically consuming meat, they operated as sophisticated players within a high-stakes food web rather than mere passive browsers. This finding reconfigures our understanding of the Pleistocene environment, revealing that the mega herbivores we viewed as gentle landscape engineers also held roles as scavengers or predators. Such dietary flexibility confirms these giants possessed a level of behavioral adaptability previously thought impossible for their lineage. But as the climate shifted, the specialized mechanics that made them architects of their domain became a lethal liability. Their sudden absence triggered a cascade that moved far beyond their own lineage, pulling at the threads of a much larger interconnected world. The void left by these titans was not merely an ecological silence. It was a structural collapse of the landscape itself. Beyond the ground sloths, the American megafauna included mastodons, mammoths, and giant beavers. Creatures that functioned as living, breathing agents of habitat maintenance. A mammoth herd did not simply exist within a forest. It actively managed the density of the understory, knocking down saplings and tearing up brush to keep corridors open. By cycling nutrients through their immense consumption of biomass, they prevented the stagnation of the prairie and the unchecked encroachment of dense thickets. This was not a passive cycle of life, but a high-pressure machine that maintained the biodiversity of an entire continent. When we read the chemical record fossilized in their molars, we see more than dietary patterns. We see the imprint of mounting physiological stress. This prompts a haunting question about these vanished giants. Did their dietary specialization, a survival strategy, ultimately lock them into a physiological dead end as localized flora shifted? What happens to an environment that relied for millions of years on the perpetual disturbance of giants, only to find those machines abruptly switched off? When those machines of the land abruptly switched off, the silence was not just ecological, it was chronological. Fossil records reveal a shift that defies the gentle rhythm of previous eras. In North America, the disappearance was surgically precise, compressing the loss of dozens of large mammal genera into a sliver of time barely wider than 2 millennia. Animals that had endured for millions of years. From the massive ground sloths to the iconic mammoths, suddenly ceased to be, their vanishing clustered at the close of the last glacial age. This was not a gradual fading away into the background noise of evolution. It was a mass termination that hit hardest above the 44-kilogram threshold, sparing the small while erasing the enormous. Why did this narrow window trigger such a comprehensive wipeout, when these same lineages had weathered previous climatic cycles intact? What specific barrier did they encounter in this final act? The question demands that we turn to the survivors, because while the giants fell, the smaller creatures endured. The pattern of this collapse suggests that size itself became a terminal liability, but the mechanism behind that selective pressure remains a sharp, unresolved edge in the heart of our history, This metabolic math was merciless. A 4-ton body requires a constant, massive intake of forage. As the climate shifted and the stable, predictable cycles of the landscape fractured, that caloric requirement became impossible to meet. While smaller, more agile survivors could burrow into the earth, retreat into narrow forest corridors, or pivot to new food sources. These giants remained locked into rigid, high-energy life cycles. Their skeletal architecture, designed for immense power, now acted as a biological anchor. The chemistry locked in their fossilized teeth confirms the timeline of this struggle, recording sharp spikes of nutritional strain in the final centuries of their existence. It was a failure of adaptability where their massive scale, once an evolutionarily sound defense, transformed into a fatal handicap. Every necessary migration route narrowed, and every high-calorie foraging zone disappeared. Yet, the rapid, synchronized nature of their decline suggests an additional, sharper stressor at work. A new force entered the environment, one that didn't just witness this decline, but potentially exploited the vulnerability of these dying titans. We must look at the arrival of this new apex pressure on the landscape to see how a slow environmental retreat turned into a total continental collapse. This apex pressure was not merely a shift in the food chain, it was the arrival of a predator for which no evolutionary defense had prepared these giants. Paul S. Martin argued that the timing of human expansion across the Americas created a lethal high-velocity contact period. As populations moved southward, they encountered herds that had never evolved to fear a bipedal hunter. The vulnerability was physiological. These animals possessed long gestation periods and low reproductive rates. A single kill by an efficient group of hunters could remove a significant portion of a local population's annual recruitment. This wasn't a slow generational pressure, but a localized and brutal harvest that rippled through the continent. If these hunters moved in a wave, they would have outpaced the ability of any species to shift its range or adapt. This argument hinges on a specific archaeological signature left behind by the first highly specialized people to traverse the vast plains and river valleys, providing a tangible link between the toolmaker and the silenced beast. This brings us to the question of the weapon itself, and whether a single culture's technology was enough to dismantle an entire continent's biological infrastructure. The projectile points themselves are the primary evidence. The Clovis-fluted blades, finely thinned, sharpened to a lethal symmetry between 13,050 and 12,750 years ago. These are not merely decorative relics of a stone age. They were high-velocity kinetic instruments, engineered to punch through dense muscle and thick protective hide. A single blade required hours of precise flint knapping, a labor-intensive investment that signals a culture fully optimized for specialized hunting. When we analyze the kinetic force required to bring down a 4-ton animal, the math suggests a level of coordinated tactical planning that shifted the rules of engagement. This was a technology designed to bypass the defensive advantages of massive size and armored skin. It remains uncertain, however, whether these scattered, transient bands exerted a continent-wide pressure, or if the evidence we recover is a localized snapshot of a much broader, more complex collapse. Before we determine if this was indeed an industry of extinction, we must examine the physical records left behind at the sites where the human and the giant finally met face to face. At Blackwater Draw and Murray Springs, the soil itself acts as a ledger. Here, the evidence is not just in the presence of these finely knapped blades, but in their spatial geometry relative to the bones. We see the stratigraphic alignment of high-velocity projectile points resting within the rib cages of mammoths and the skeletal remains of ground sloths. This is not a matter of scavenged remains. The orientation of these kills suggests tactical, coordinated strikes. The Clovis people did not wander aimlessly. They were highly mobile, specialized hunters, operating with an efficiency that seems to have targeted the most vulnerable age cohorts within these giant populations. By concentrating their effort on the slow-growing, low-fertility megafauna, they likely disrupted the demographic stability of species already pushed to the edge by shifting environments. If a few hunters could dismantle an entire ecosystem, why does the archaeological signal change so abruptly south of the northern plains? This raises the question of whether the North was simply the starting line for a much larger continent-spanning phenomenon. The archaeological record of the Southern Hemisphere adds a sharp, focused edge to this investigation. In the vast reaches of the South American pampas, human impact manifests through the appearance of fishtail projectile points, stemmed, high-velocity weaponry that surfaces in the stratigraphic layers around 12,900 years ago. These artifacts do not appear in isolation. They emerge just as the megafaunal decline accelerates, signaling a shift toward specialized, systemic pressure on the continent's largest residents. These were not random encounters. The geographical mapping of these sites reveals a synchronized wave of predatory stress, a lethal movement that tracked the retreat of the giants across the southern hemisphere with calculated intent. As human groups refined their tactical reach, the anatomical vulnerabilities of the megafauna became increasingly exposed to these highly effective tools. This raises a pressing question. How did this hunt actually play out in the mud and dust of the ancient plains? To understand the true mechanics of this pressure, we must look beyond the stone points to the fossilized sites themselves. Deep within the sediment of an Argentine site, a specific, chilling piece of evidence bridges the gap between the hunter and the hunted, leaving us to consider the finality of that encounter. At the Campo Laborde site in the Argentinian Pampas, the geological record shifts from abstraction into a forensic crime scene. Beneath deep layers of sediment, archaeologists unearth the remains of a giant ground sloth, Megatherium americanum, dated to 12,600 years ago. Unambiguous cut marks etched into the dense limb bones, matched with specialized stone butchery tools, document the systematic harvesting of these creatures for their massive stores of meat and marrow. The precise, methodical nature of these incisions reveals a sophisticated knowledge of megafauna anatomy, requiring tactical coordination and rigorous planning. By targeting the most nutritionally dense sections of the carcass, these hunters exerted lethal, concentrated pressure on a species hampered by a notoriously slow reproductive cycle. Every groove in the bone chronicles a meeting between human ingenuity and prehistoric scale. This physical evidence proves that these giants were not invincible. This encounter, however, raises a deeper question regarding the hunter's intent. When early humans ceased to view these 7-meter-tall titans as terrifying forces of nature and began to treat them as a harvestable resource, the dynamic of the landscape changed forever. We must now look at the psychology of that transition and what it meant to hold dominion over such an awe-inspiring ancient world. The transition from viewing these titans as entities of fear to seeing them as meat marked a definitive psychological shift in the Paleo-Indian worldview. Standardizing the butchery of creatures that had occupied the pinnacle of the American landscape for millions of years decoupled the megafauna from their status as untouchable forces. The systematic extraction of marrow and the targeted removal of nutrient-rich tissues suggests a technical mastery that required sophisticated social cooperation. These groups performed high-risk operations requiring precise anatomical knowledge of skeletal structures to bypass thick, protective pelts. Such tactical coordination implies these hunting parties operated under a rigorous cultural framework of shared labor and risk management. As the skeletal evidence from sites like Campo Laborde demonstrates, this pressure was applied with an efficacy that ignored traditional ecological boundaries. Yet, even with these tools and coordinated social structures, scientists continue to weigh whether this predatory impact was sufficient to force such a rapid, continent-wide collapse. If the environment remained stable, this level of human pressure might have been sustainable. But were these ecosystems truly as resilient as they seemed? Or were they already suffering under a far more silent, invisible weight that no hunter's blade could touch? The geologic record offers a harsh correction to the idea of a simple, human-led collapse. Ice core data from Greenland exposes a world hemorrhaging stability, defined not by steady conditions, but by violent, relentless oscillations. These climate pulses were not gradual shifts. They were seismic changes in temperature and precipitation that dismantled the megafauna's foundational habitats. Forests once reliable for browse began to vanish, while vast, open grasslands fractured into isolated, high-stress refugia. These beasts were not merely facing external pressure. They were trapped in a tightening bottleneck of metabolic failure. When the environment dictates the availability of every calorie, the margin for survival disappears. This volatility suggests the giants were already retreating from a landscape, losing its ability to sustain their sheer biological mass. Long before the first fluted blade found its mark. This raises the question of how these mega herbivores reacted to these initial systemic tremors, and if they were already failing to sustain their numbers before the peak of the collapse. That catastrophic threshold was the arrival of the younger Dryas, a violent, sudden return to near-glacial conditions around 12,900 years ago, which locked the northern hemisphere in a brutal ice age grip and severed the stability of the entire continent. This was not a slow slide into winter, but an abrupt climatic lurch that shattered the existing order. Within a single human generation, the lush mosaic of the landscape disintegrated, and the cooling grew severe enough to freeze the survival mechanisms of any creature dependent on consistent, year-round vegetation. To understand why this blow landed so hard, we have to rewind to the warmth that preceded it. During the warming phase that peaked around 14,700 years ago, populations surged across the continent, finding temporary relief in nutrient-rich corridors opened by receding ice. Yet bone chemistry from that era reveals a hidden cost beneath the apparent abundance. These animals were already operating on a razor's edge of nutritional stability. When the climate pivoted toward cold, two forces closed on them at once. The metabolic expense of holding body heat climbed steeply, while the quality and quantity of available forage fell away. The habitat mosaic that had fed their gargantuan requirements broke apart into disconnected patches, and once interconnected grazing lands narrowed into high-density pockets the giants could no longer reshape. Advanced statistical modeling of the fossil record sharpens the picture into a lethal correlation. The steeper the regional temperature decline, the greater the loss of species richness. It was not a steady descent, but a series of jolting atmospheric oscillations, each thermal dip lowering the caloric ceiling of the botanical base until the food web itself reorganized beneath them. Their digestive physiology, tuned across eons to stable, high-yield environments, now confronted brackish or vanishing water and forage too sparse to sustain their bulk. For animals this size, every kilometer traveled in search of a meal became an energy debt they could not repay, and their sheer mass trapped them in a cycle of localized overgrazing that stripped the very vegetation meant to replenish them. As nutrient cycling stalled, the land these creatures had engineered for millennia turned against them. By the time the younger Dryas fully set in, the modeling suggests the megafauna were already brittle, thinned, cornered, and waiting for a final trigger. It is precisely here that the fossil record shows their decline overlapping with the arrival of high-velocity hunting technology, layering a new predator onto populations that environmental stress had already pushed to the brink. Yet a dissonance remains, a gap between this slow attrition and the sheer, sudden violence required to erase a continent's dominant species in a geological instant. That discrepancy forces us to look beyond the terrestrial landscape entirely, toward a darker, more explosive possibility that arrived from above. The atmosphere holds a record, a silent witness to a moment of planetary fracture. The younger Dryas impact hypothesis shifts the focus from the slow grind of climate cycles or the focused efforts of hunters to a singular, violent threshold. Proponents argue that an extraterrestrial bolide, a comet or asteroid, interrupted the epoch, an object perhaps kilometers across, detonating in the high atmosphere above the northern ice sheets. Such an airburst would not merely have struck the Earth, it would have ignited a global thermal pulse. The theory suggests this impact initiated the younger Dryas cold snap by destabilizing the ice, effectively flipping a planetary switch. For the megafauna, the result would have been an immediate shift from a manageable climate to an environmental collapse. Yet, if such a celestial event occurred, it would have left a signature, a physical layer hidden within the crust, waiting for confirmation. The central challenge remains: is there truly a distinct, widespread marker of an extraterrestrial visitor, or is the evidence a collection of terrestrial anomalies misidentified as cosmic destruction? That search for the smoking gun leads directly to the work of scientists like James Kennett. Their investigations focus on the younger Dryas boundary layer, a thin, global stratum deposited exactly 800 years ago. This narrow sliver of geological time serves as the primary battleground for their hypothesis. Where others see a minor environmental shift, these researchers identify a high-energy signature that shouldn't exist under standard conditions. They contend that the data is not mere noise or local contamination, but a default physical record of a bolide impact. According to this model, an extraterrestrial body did not merely pass near our orbit. It fragmented or detonated within the atmosphere, scattering a distinct array of materials across 2 continents. This event, they argue, was the singular hammer blow that crippled the megafauna and destabilized the climate in one synchronized strike. If their data is accurate, the extinction was not a gradual 1,000-year malaise, but a sudden, violent punctuation of life. The debate now hinges on the microscopic contents of that specific boundary layer. The first breakthrough surfaces not in theory, but in the metals buried within that thin band of sediment. Researchers are now finding magnetic grains laced with iridium embedded there, a material trace that reads like a geological affidavit. On this planet, iridium is vanishingly rare at the surface, locked deep within the Earth's mantle. But in the thin, dark streak of soil representing those years, it appears in concentrations that defy terrestrial explanation. It is a classic fingerprint of cosmic debris, suggesting that a bolide, a comet, or an asteroid didn't just pass through our atmosphere, but fragmented with enough violence to pepper the landscape with extraterrestrial fallout. The presence of these grains suggests a violent, sudden alteration to the environment. One on a scale that simple climate cycles cannot account for. If this material was delivered from space, other physical signatures should be hidden in the same layer of the Earth. What other strange, ultra-hard particles might be trapped within those ancient horizons, proving the extent of the shock? The deeper researchers look, the more this geological horizon reveals. Beyond the iridium, they are finding microscopic, spherical droplets trapped in the soil. These are magnetic microspherules, tiny, glassy beads forged only under the temperatures of an atmospheric explosion. They are the chemical scars of a sudden searing thermal event. But the evidence reaches a level of extreme, high-pressure physics that terrestrial volcanism simply cannot replicate. Scientists have extracted nanodiamonds from this same strata. These carbon lattices require the immense, instantaneous force of a shock wave to form, a structural transformation that demands gigapascals of pressure. Their presence across multiple sites implies an event that did not merely burn, but physically shattered the mineral environment of the Northern Hemisphere. This isn't just chemical debris. It is the physical footprint of an object moving with enough kinetic energy to displace the Earth's own structure. What was the reach of this fire? And how did it leave its signature in the air the giants were breathing? The evidence rests in microscopic strata buried deep within the soil. Layers of charcoal and soot appear at the Younger Dryas boundary, concentrated at a level dated precisely to that moment of faunal collapse. These layers represent widespread combustion, consistent with a high-energy atmospheric event rather than seasonal burn-offs. Researchers recover carbon spherules, tiny, hollow spheres that form only when organic material is vaporized by heat exceeding typical forest fires. When mapped across North America and into Europe, these findings reveal a synchronous, continent-spanning deposit of charred debris. As the atmosphere surged with heat, the landscape was stripped of its biomass, leaving an ash layer that serves as a terminal sediment for the remains of the giants buried beneath it. The magnitude of this combustion points to a mechanism capable of altering entire ecosystems in days. Yet, these charcoal deposits are only the surface layer of a much deeper, more complex chemical disturbance hidden within the Earth. Even more exotic markers appear in the geological record, signs that hint at an origin far beyond the reach of terrestrial fire. These exotic molecules, fullerenes, act as a microscopic black box. Trapped within their caged, carbon atom architecture are helium isotopes with a distinct extraterrestrial signature. An elemental ratio that does not exist in our own atmosphere. When researchers extract these from the 12,800-year-old sediment, they aren't just finding a strange chemical anomaly. They are looking at the molecular shrapnel of a high-energy collision. The evidence deepens with the discovery of shocked quartz. Under standard geological pressure, quartz grains fracture predictably, but these specific samples exhibit planar deformation features, a jagged scarring that only occurs under the instantaneous extreme force of an explosive impact. To find these grains embedded in the same layer as the soot and iridium is to see the physical imprint of a violent arrival. It points toward a kinetic event of such velocity that it fused common Earth into rare shock-hardened glass and scattered it across the continent. Yet, this debris field raises a critical complication. How does a singular explosive arrival translate into a global climate collapse? And how could a fleeting sky blaze drive entire species to the brink of extinction? The answer lies in the atmospheric aftermath of such a high-energy delivery. A bolide strike on this scale would inject tens of millions of tons of pulverized ice, silicate rock, and stratospheric soot into the jet stream. This was not a localized catastrophe. It functioned as a temporary global volcanic-style winter. The resulting aerosol veil acted as a planetary shutter, reflecting incoming solar radiation back into space and collapsing the thermal balance of the northern hemisphere almost overnight. This abrupt transition from a warm interglacial to a deep freeze state provides the physical link between the impact debris found in the boundary layer and the rapid, sustained cooling of the younger Dryas. It establishes a brutal engine of climate regulation failure, where the planet lost the ability to retain heat within months. If the climate shifted through an atmospheric injection of this magnitude, the biological consequences would be immediate and systemic. This raises a critical question. Why does the timing of this atmospheric collapse align so precisely with the disappearance of the giants and the documented decline of the Clovis culture? This temporal alignment, the sudden deep freeze, the simultaneous vanishings of megafauna, and the abrupt end of the Clovis toolkit creates the primary friction in modern archaeology. Critics of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis point to the missing crater, the traditional requirement for a planetary strike. Proponents, however, argue a fragmented comet airburst would distribute geochemical signatures like nanodiamonds and shocked quartz across the boundary layer, without ever cratering the default. It presents a model of a lethal, high-altitude atmospheric explosion rather than a surface collision. For the Clovis hunters, this event marks a hard break in the stratigraphic record. Their specialized fluted blades, designed for high-velocity engagement with giants, vanish as the landscape shifts toward cold-adapted scarcity. Whether this represents a direct loss of primary prey or a total environmental collapse that rendered their sophisticated weapon obsolete remains the subject of intense investigation. The data reveals a violent convergence where humanity and the giants were both destabilized by a singular catastrophic pulse. As scientists test this trigger against the totality of the extinction, they are increasingly forced to look beyond any single theory to explain the system failure that followed. This convergence suggests a multi-stage collapse, a cascade where external shocks collided with a population already tethered to its limits. The metabolic demands of these massive animals require constant, high-quality forage, leaving zero room for error. When rainfall patterns shift or temperatures spike, charting the strain preserved in their fossilized teeth exposes a population in freefall. These giants were not simply dying. They were being systematically starved by a changing planet. This pressure forced remaining herds into disconnected, shrinking refugia. In these fragmented corridors, the hunter-prey dynamic shifted from sustainable interaction to a system-wide crash. When humans encountered a population trapped by localized drought or shifting vegetation, the contact acted as a fatal accelerant. The giants could no longer migrate to greener pastures. Those paths were effectively severed by shifting biomes and territories. The biological rigidity that served these species for millions of years became a terminal vulnerability, offering no escape from the narrowing window of survival. The system failed from the inside out, leaving only the most isolated individuals to persist. The map of their final days is shrinking, and it is within these final, desperate pockets of life that the true cost of this environmental transition is hidden. Within these final, desperate pockets of life, the synergy of failure becomes clear. While habitat loss dismantled the corridors that allowed these creatures to track seasonally available forage, the arrival of mobile, cooperative hunters turned the landscape into a lethal gauntlet. A megafauna population, already straining against a narrowed metabolic threshold, cannot absorb the removal of even a small percentage of its breeding adults. Each individual represents a decade of energy investment. The loss of one mother is not a single death, but the forfeiture of a lineage. The archaeological record shows that butchery sites were not merely communal feasts, but tactical points of intercept. By targeting watering holes or restricted passes, the few remaining access points in a drying continent, human groups leveraged the environment's own limitations against the giants. This was a war of attrition where the megafauna's slow reproductive rate became its primary liability. As the climate forced them into smaller, predictable clusters, the prey became the trap. The giants were already fighting a losing battle against their own biology. They were cornered, watching as the shadow of a new apex predator narrowed the distance between them and the end of their era. That shift into predictable clusters wasn't just a spatial trap, it was a metabolic death sentence. Giant sloths were specialized browsers, evolved to extract nutrients from specific, energy-dense vegetation that thrived in stable, interglacial corridors. As these preferred foraging grounds fragmented, the energy required for their vast bodies to move between isolated patches of food exceeded the caloric return of the meals they found. The microscopic wear scarring the teeth of late surviving individuals traces a downward spiral of physiological stress. The chemistry sealed in that same enamel reveals a final, desperate reliance on less nutritious fibrous fallback plants, signaling that their dietary options had collapsed alongside their habitat. When Clovis hunters arrived, they didn't just encounter individuals. They intercepted populations already weakened by a shrinking resource base. This intersection of ecological vulnerability and predatory efficiency turned the simple act of survival into a reproductive dead end. But the loss of these behemoths triggered something even more pervasive than a simple decline in numbers. As these biological engines were removed from the landscape, the very structure of the environment began to unravel. Without the constant browsing pressure of massive herbivores to clear brush, forests encroached upon the vast grasslands that once supported complex predator-prey relationships. This shift triggered a rapid contraction of biodiversity, a silent collapse of the food web. Smaller species, which previously relied on the mosaic of microhabitats created by constant movement and trampling, found themselves choked out by dense, encroaching vegetation. The loss extended far beyond the iconic sloth, signaling the total dissolution of the continent's environmental maintenance systems. Nitrogen cycling, once driven by the massive throughput of megafaunal digestion, sputtered to a halt, starving the soil of essential nutrients that had enriched the Americas for eons. Seed dispersal patterns, once facilitated by creatures that could transport tons of biological matter across entire provinces, stopped entirely, leaving specialized flora to wither. We are left with a landscape that feels natural but is, in truth, a hollowed-out remnant of the living system it once was. Why did this particular collapse prove so final, even though these lineages had endured similar environmental cycles for millions of years prior? The answer lies in the velocity of change. During previous interglacials, the shift from glacial cold to warmth unfolded over millennia, granting megafauna the luxury of time to adjust their ranges. This final transition, however, operated on a near instantaneous scale. The synergy of rapidly fragmenting biomes and tactical, specialized hunting created a demographic bottleneck that precluded any possibility of recovery. While their ancestors possessed the biological elasticity to endure previous oscillations, this era offered no such margin. Clovis projectile technology specifically targeted the most vulnerable members of these populations, juveniles and gestating females, effectively stalling the already slow reproductive cycles of these titans. Their social structures could not absorb such compound losses. The evolutionary clock, calibrated for slow environmental rhythms, was shattered by the simultaneous arrival of a high-velocity apex predator and the brutal thermal pulse of the younger Dryas. This alignment of pressures removed every corridor for survival. It was a biological reality that permanently reset the architecture of the American wilderness, leaving the landscapes we inhabit today as mere echoes of a once vast ecological machine. Today, only small arboreal sloths remain, clinging to high forest canopies. They represent a radical contraction of a lineage once defined by continental dominance. While their titanic ancestors were hyper-specialized for open plains, their modern descendants persisted by retreating into the vertical refuge of the tropical rainforest. Survival here functioned through geographic exclusion. By occupying these narrow, isolated niches, modern sloths stayed beneath the lethal pressures that erased their relatives. They avoided the habitat fragmentation that forced the giants into the crosshairs of human hunters and climate volatility. When the environment resets, immense size becomes a fatal metabolic debt. The giants perished because they were too conspicuous to hide and too resource-dependent to wait for the world to stabilize. We see their legacy not in the living, but in the permanent, altered state of our modern plains, a world engineered for the small, forever bereft of the titans that once held the balance. The absence of these monumental creatures triggered a fundamental re-engineering of the modern biosphere. Once, these giants acted as biological pumps, moving massive quantities of nitrogen and phosphorus across thousands of miles, enriching inland soils through dung deposits and constant movement. With their exit, the soil chemistry of the Americas changed overnight. Forests shifted from dynamically maintained clearings to stagnant, fire-prone thickets, fundamentally altering how sunlight reached the forest floor and starving the plant species that once depended on giant sloths to carry their seeds across entire provinces. Current ecological models often underestimate how quickly a complex system enters a positive feedback loop of collapse once its primary engineers are removed. We inhabit a depleted version of the Americas, defined by the gaps left by those who walked here first. The mystery of the Pleistocene megafauna is not a settled history. It is a persistent, active investigation. Researchers are currently utilizing advanced GIS modeling and high-resolution ground-penetrating radar to map potential cache sites in the South American high desert, seeking more butchery-marked skeletons that could sharpen the timeline of human arrival. Simultaneously, international teams are analyzing lake sediments from the Pacific Northwest, looking for specific charcoal spikes that might provide the high-resolution data needed to finally weigh the impact of a singular cosmic event against long-term climate shifts. These field efforts now employ a cross-disciplinary approach that refuses to silo human behavior from environmental volatility. Every recovered microspherule, every refined carbon-dated femur fragment, and every new isotope analysis adds a piece to a shifting puzzle, showing how quickly a stable ecosystem can reach a breaking point. We are analyzing a planetary-scale collapse where the evidence is buried beneath 10 millennia of debris. This extinction serves as a high-stakes metric for current environmental volatility, proving that the threshold for catastrophe is lower than the biological record once suggested. The search continues not just to name the cause, but to map the mechanics of a catastrophe that remains. Even now, our most vital cautionary lesson. The giants did not just leave. They carried the stability of the entire continent's life support system into extinction with them, leaving us with a world that is an ecological shadow of its former self.